Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're tackling something that I think is on a lot of people's minds lately, and that's this whole intersection of religion and politics.
Yeah, it seems like it's really heating up, doesn't it?
It does. And we've got some fascinating articles and event details here, one from Advent Messenger and another from Catholics for Catholics, that really, I think, get to the heart of this whole thing.
What I find really interesting is that these sources give us some real insights into the why behind all of this, why this merging of faith and politics is happening the way that it is. I think that's what's going to be so insightful for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. We're here to help you sift through it all, understand the different perspectives, and then, equip you to kind of come to your own conclusions.
Let's do it.
Okay, so picture this. It's March 19th, 2025. You're at Mar-a-Lago, right? The iconic estate of former President Donald Trump. But you're not just there for the opulence or the history. You're attending the Catholic Prayer for America Gala, an event that seems to be right at the center of this whole religion and politics discussion.
Yeah, and I think the choice of Mar-a-Lago as the venue is really interesting too, right?
Yeah.
This isn't just a private club, it's a symbol of power, a stage where, a lot of political theater plays out.
Totally.
I don't think it's an accident that they chose to have it there.
No, I think they're making a statement.
Yeah.
Now, the organizer behind this gala is Catholics for Catholics, an organization that's super committed to promoting Catholic doctrine and its influence on public policy. And get this, they're sponsoring 100 Catholic priests to attend.
Wow, that's a pretty big investment.
Right.
That speaks volumes about their intentions.
It does. It really does.
They talk about inspiring a new wave of Catholicism, changing the nation, shaping a more holy and moral future for America. And it's really clear that they see this as a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
They want to reclaim what they see as America's Christian roots through emphasizing the Bible and the Constitution. So I think the question becomes, how does that vision actually align with the reality of a pluralistic society like ours?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big question, isn't it? And it's not just an isolated phenomenon either.
Yeah.
This event kind of seems to be a symptom of a larger trend, particularly within Donald Trump's second administration.
Right.
This increasing, intertwining of politics and religion, with Catholicism really taking a prominent role. Just look at some of his key cabinet appointments.
Yeah.
I mean, Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy. The list goes on and on.
Oh, yeah.
And what do they all have in common?
They're all devout Roman Catholics.
Exactly.
So that's got to have implications, right?
Yeah.
Having that concentration of folks with strong religious affiliations in such powerful positions could be a good thing. Some people might see it that way, right? Emphasizing moral and social values in government.
Yeah.
But it could also raise some red flags.
Yeah, definitely.
About potential biases in policymaking, the blurring of the lines between church and state.
I mean, it's a very complex situation for sure with, potential benefits and risks.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about, the individuals in power either. Trump has actually implemented several initiatives that further highlight this kind of blending of religion and government.
Like what?
We'll take the White House Faith Office, for example. It was specifically designed to bring faith-based perspectives into policymaking.
That's pretty significant, isn't it?
Yeah.
Having faith directly influence government policy, I mean, that's a concept that's had a long and often controversial history.
It has.
I mean, we can even look at the executive order that was aimed at combating anti-Christian bias, spearheaded by Attorney General Pam Bondi. That was a clear signal that the administration's prioritizing religious interests.
For sure. And then you bring Advent Messenger into the mix, and they're talking about biblical prophecy.
Yeah.
It adds a whole other layer of intrigue to the situation.
Right.
They're suggesting that this alliance between Catholicism and the Trump administration could be a sign of what they're calling the image of the beast crisis.
Yeah.
As foretold in Revelation 13.
Now that's where things get really interesting.
Right.
It's important to remember that biblical prophecy can be interpreted in many different ways. And it should be approached with caution and critical thinking. But it's fascinating to see how this prophecy really resonates with certain segments of the population.
Totally. Advent Messenger interprets Revelation 13 as this foretelling of a future where religious and political powers merge.
Right.
Using their combined authority to actually enforce doctrine through law. And they see this current alliance as a potential step towards that scenario, which ultimately leads to the mark of the beast.
Okay, so while Advent Messenger presents a very specific interpretation, it's crucial to remember that these ancient texts, they're often debated.
Yeah.
Their interpretations can vary based on the context. So, it's great to engage with their perspective, but also seek out alternative viewpoints and keep the historical context in mind.
For sure. No, the lineup for the Catholic Prayer for America Gala itself is pretty thought-provoking.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you got figures like Bishop Joseph Strickland, General Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, Jack Posobiec, Dr. Taylor Marshall.
Wow.
It's a pretty diverse group of speakers with a range of backgrounds and opinions.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
They all bring their own unique perspective, their own baggage, their own agenda.
Right.
And having them all together at this event, that raises some interesting questions about what they're trying to say, what the overall goals are.
Right. What's the message here?
Yeah. What do you think it tells us about the direction this whole movement is headed?
That is a great question, and one we definitely want to unpack. But first, let's take a closer look at this image of the beast idea. I know it can seem kind of out there to some people.
Sure.
But I think it speaks to this deeper anxiety that a lot of people are feeling right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Whether or not someone subscribes to this specific interpretation of Revelation,
Yeah.
I think the idea of this powerful, potentially oppressive force emerging from the fusion of religious and political authority, that's a concept that resonates throughout history.
It does.
It's like this primal fear, this cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked and faith becomes blind.
Right, it's almost like a cautionary tale whispered across centuries.
Yeah.
Reminding us to be vigilant, to be on guard against those dangers of fanaticism and authoritarianism.
Exactly. And the thing is, those dangers aren't just theoretical.
Yeah.
We have so many examples throughout history of what happens when religious fervor is used for political purposes, often with devastating consequences. I mean, you just have to think about the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the Salem witch trials, to see just how destructive that fusion can be.
Right. Those are some very sobering examples. And while those historical events might seem distant, they do serve as a very stark reminder of why it's so important to maintain that separation of church and state.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
That principle of separation, as it's enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, it was designed to safeguard religious freedom for everyone, to ensure that no single faith or belief system can dominate the government or infringe on the rights of others.
It's about creating a space where people can practice their faith freely without fear of coercion or discrimination.
Right.
And also protecting those who hold different beliefs or no religious beliefs at all.
Exactly. It's a very delicate balance.
It is.
But it's essential for a truly pluralistic and democratic society.
For sure. And you know what we've been talking about, this line of separation, it's not always so clear-cut.
Right.
It can become blurred.
Absolutely.
Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally.
Yeah.
And that's when you lead to see those tensions and conflicts arise, and they're not easy to resolve.
No, they're not. And that's where those anxieties surrounding this Catholic Prayer for America Gala and the broader trend of increased religious influence in the Trump administration really come to light.
Yeah, people are worried about this potential erosion of that vital separation and what it could mean for the future of religious freedom in America.
And those concerns are valid.
Yeah.
That Advent Messenger article with its focus on the image of the beast prophecy, it might seem alarmist to some.
Right.
But I think it speaks to a very real and understandable anxiety about religious beliefs being used to justify policies that could infringe on people's liberties.
Yeah, it's almost like that prophecy is being used as a lens to view current events.
Yeah, I like that.
It magnifies those anxieties and concerns.
It does. Whether or not we agree with that specific interpretation of Revelation, I think it's a good reminder of this age-old tension between faith and power.
Right.
The need to always be vigilant in safeguarding those individual rights and freedoms.
So given this backdrop of heightened anxiety and the potential pitfalls that we've talked about, where do we go from here?
Right.
How do we navigate this really complex terrain where faith and politics intersect?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And there are no easy answers or simple solutions.
Yeah.
But I think recognizing the complexity of it all is a really good starting point.
Okay.
It's not black and white. There's a whole spectrum of perspectives and concerns.
Right, it's a very nuanced situation.
Exactly, and that's why respectful dialogue is so important.
Yeah.
Listening to different viewpoints, being willing to understand even if we don't agree.
Absolutely. Civil discourse is key, especially when we're dealing with such emotionally charged issues.
Right. It's about finding common ground and building bridges and trying to come up with solutions that respect both religious freedom and individual rights.
It sounds like a pretty tall order in today's climate.
Yeah, it is, but it's not impossible. It starts with each of us, as individuals, making that conscious effort to listen, to empathize, and to really seek to understand.
So you're advocating for a more nuanced and compassionate approach to this whole debate.
Yes.
One that recognizes the complexities and tries to find that balance between these often competing interests.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond those slogans and sound bites and getting into those deeper, more meaningful conversations about what role faith should play in public life.
And I think that includes being mindful of how religious narratives like this image of the beast prophecy can be used in ways that might actually incite fear, division, or even violence.
You're absolutely right.
It's a good reminder that even those deeply held beliefs should be subject to some scrutiny and critical thinking.
Absolutely.
Blind faith, whether it's in a political ideology or a religious doctrine, can be really dangerous.
Very true. It's about finding that sweet spot where faith can inform our values and inspire us to act for the greater good, without crossing that line into coercion or intolerance or the suppression of dissenting views.
I love that that's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
So as we start wrapping up this first part of our deep dive, are there any key takeaways that you think our listeners should keep in mind?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this relationship between religion and politics, it's complex and it's always changing.
Right.
And there's no easy answer. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah.
It's all about understanding that historical context and recognizing both the benefits and the risks, and then engaging in that thoughtful dialogue that we keep talking about.
Absolutely. And it's so important to remember that these issues are really personal for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Faith and politics, they're intertwined with our core values and beliefs. And those conversations can get pretty heated.
They can, and that's why it's so important to come at these discussions with empathy and respect, even when we disagree.
For sure.
And remember, not everyone within a religious group feels the same way. Not all Catholics or Protestants or members of any faith tradition, they don't necessarily share the same views on these issues.
Right. So as we kind of wrap up this first part of our deep dive, what's one final thought that you want to leave our listeners with?
I would encourage everyone to really consider the role of prophecy in shaping how we understand what's happening in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
How do our beliefs about the future actually influence what we're doing today?
Right.
And how can we engage with prophecy in a way that's meaningful but also responsible?
That's an excellent question.
Yeah.
And it's one that each of us has to answer for ourselves. But I think the most important thing is to stay informed, be critical of your sources, and engage in respectful dialogue about these complex issues.
That's great advice.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with part 2.
Sounds great. Picking up where we left off, this Catholic Prayer for America Gala and everything it kind of represents really highlights this growing anxiety that people have around the intersection of religion and politics.
Yeah, and it's not just limited to this one event or, this group of people. This sense of unease really seems to be permeating a much broader conversation.
It does.
But, the role of faith in public life.
Yeah, it's like we're at this crossroads, trying to figure out how to navigate this really complex terrain where deeply held beliefs meet the machinery of government.
Right, and I think that's where the whole discussion around biblical prophecy becomes even more relevant. Like we mentioned earlier, Advent Messenger views this whole Catholic-Trump alliance through the lens of that image of the beast prophecy in Revelation 13.
Right, and like we talked about, different interpretations exist, but that one really seems to tap into that primal fear, that warning about the potential dangers of unchecked power and blind faith.
It is interesting how this ancient text written centuries ago still holds so much power and resonance for people today.
Yeah.
It speaks to this timeless concern, I think, about the potential for tyranny and oppression, especially when religious and political authority get mixed up together.
That's such a crucial point. It's like this prophecy acts as a mirror in a way, reflecting our anxieties about how power can be misused,
right,
regardless of whether we interpret it literally or symbolically.
It's almost like a cautionary tale, whispered down through the ages.
Yeah.
Reminding us to always be vigilant.
Be on guard.
Yeah, to be on guard against the dangers of fanaticism, and authoritarianism.
And those dangers aren't just hypothetical.
No.
History is full of examples of what happens when religious fervor gets harnessed for political ends.
Right.
And it often leads to devastating consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, we can look back at the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the Salem witch trials.
Right.
These are all stark reminders of the destructive potential that comes when you fuse those two things together.
They're very sobering examples. And, even though those historical events may seem distant, they really do serve as a reminder of why it's so important to maintain that separation of church and state.
Absolutely. That principle of separation, as it's enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, it was designed to protect religious freedom for all.
Yeah.
To make sure that no single belief system can have too much influence over the government or take away other people's rights.
Right. It's about creating a space where people can practice their faith openly without fear of being coerced or discriminated against.
Yes.
While at the same time protecting those who hold different beliefs or no religious beliefs at all.
Exactly. And as we've been talking about this line of separation, it's not always so clear-cut.
No, it's not.
It can become blurred.
Right.
And that's where the anxieties surrounding this Catholic Prayer for America gala and this broader trend of increased religious influence within the Trump administration, I think that's where these anxieties really come to the forefront.
Right. People are worried about this erosion of that separation and what it could mean for religious freedom in America.
And I think those concerns are valid. That Advent Messenger article with its focus on the image of the beast prophecy, it might seem a little over the top to some, but I think it reflects a very real anxiety that people have about how religious beliefs could be used to justify policies that infringe on people's liberties.
Right. It's almost as if this prophecy is being used as a lens through which to view what's happening right now.
Yeah, that's
it magnifies those anxieties and concerns.
It does. Whether or not we personally subscribe to that particular interpretation of Revelation, I think it's a good reminder of this constant tension between faith and power, and the need to constantly be vigilant in safeguarding individual rights and freedoms.
Okay, so given all of this, this backdrop of heightened anxiety, the potential pitfalls that we talked about, where do we go from here?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is.
There are no easy answers. But I think the first step is really just acknowledging the complexity of it all. It's not a black and white issue. It's this whole spectrum of perspectives and concerns that need to be taken into consideration.
Right. And that's why respectful dialogue is so important.
It is.
Listening to different viewpoints, trying to understand where people are coming from, even if we don't agree with them.
Exactly. Civil discourse. That's essential, especially when you're dealing with such emotionally charged issues like this.
It is.
It's about finding that common ground and building bridges and trying to work towards solutions that respect both religious freedom and individual rights.
That sounds like a pretty tall order in today's polarized climate.
It is, but it's not impossible. And it starts with each one of us as individuals, making that conscious effort to listen to, empathize, to really try to understand where the other side is coming from.
So you're basically advocating for a more nuanced and compassionate approach to this whole debate.
Yeah, I think so.
One that recognizes the complexities and tries to find that balance between these competing interests.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond the slogans and the sound bites and really getting into those deeper, more meaningful conversations about the role of faith in public life.
And I think that includes being mindful of how religious narratives, like this image of the beast prophecy, can be used in ways that might incite fear and division.
Yeah.
Or even violence.
You're right. It's a good reminder that even our most deeply held beliefs should be subject to scrutiny and critical thinking.
Yes, blind faith, whether it's in a political ideology or religious doctrine, can be dangerous.
We have to find that sweet spot where faith can inform our values and inspire us to do good, but without crossing that line into coercion or intolerance or trying to suppress dissenting views.
I love that that's a really powerful idea. So as we move towards the conclusion of our deep dive in part 3, what are some things that our listeners can do to navigate this complex landscape and engage in this conversation in a constructive way?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed, to educate yourself about the issues, and to be aware of all the different perspectives that are out there. Read from a variety of sources, talk to people who hold different views, and be willing to challenge your own assumptions and biases.
That's great advice. And I think it's also important to remember that we don't have to have all the answers.
Yeah.
It's okay to be uncertain, to wrestle with these complex issues, and to approach them with humility and a willingness to learn.
I agree. There's no shame in saying, I don't know.
Right.
In fact, I think that's often the first step towards true understanding.
I think that's a great place to pause.
Well, good.
In part 3, we'll explore some specific examples of how this tension between religion and politics is playing out in current events, and we'll talk about some potential ways forward.
I look forward to it.
Welcome back to our deep dive, everybody. It's been a really fascinating look at this complex world of religion and politics so far.
It has. We've covered so much ground already.
We have, that Catholic Prayer for America Gala at Mar-a-Lago really got us thinking.
They did.
And then, stepping back and looking at the historical and philosophical context surrounding the separation of church and state.
Right. We've explored those anxieties around the image of the beast prophecy and looked at historical examples of what can happen when faith and power get too intertwined.
Right, like those unintended consequences.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget the importance of protecting religious freedom for everyone.
It's a lot to unpack, but it's so important to have these conversations.
I agree, especially now when these issues are becoming so prominent.
They are.
For this final part of our deep dive, I think it would be good to bring things down to earth a bit.
Okay.
Look at some concrete examples of how this tension between religion and politics is playing out in the real world.
That sounds like a good plan. What do you have in mind?
Well, for starters, let's think about the debates surrounding social issues like abortion and same-sex marriage.
Oh, yeah, those are big ones.
Those are areas where religious beliefs often clash with secular values,
right,
leading to these really heated debates and legal battles.
They do, and those are some real hot-button issues
that
often divide people along religious lines. So how do you see this all playing out, with the Trump administration's policies and the growing influence of those conservative Catholic voices within the government?
Well, it's interesting to see how the administration is approaching these sensitive areas.
Right.
On the one hand, you have those appointments like Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio.
Right.
Both known for their strong Catholic faith and conservative views on these social issues. But then you have President Trump himself, who seems to have a more pragmatic approach, maybe less ideologically driven.
Yeah, he's often been described as more of a deal maker than an ideologue.
Exactly. Yep. So how do you see this dynamic playing out in terms of actual policy decisions?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's a tough balancing act.
It is.
The administration has made some gestures towards its conservative religious base, like that executive order on anti-Christian bias.
Right.
But at the same time, they've been careful not to alienate those more moderate or secular voters.
Right. They're walking a tightrope.
They are. And it makes you wonder how sustainable this approach really is in the long run.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to please everyone without fully committing to one side or the other.
It really is a delicate dance. And it raises the question, how are these competing interests ultimately going to be reconciled?
Right. Are we going to see this continued push towards integrating religious values into public policy? Or will that separation of church and state remain a strong guiding principle?
I think that's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And I don't think anyone has the answer right now.
No. But it's going to be interesting to watch how it all unfolds.
It's going to be fascinating. And I think it highlights how important it is to stay engaged.
Yeah.
To stay informed and to be involved in the political process.
Absolutely. Our voices matter, and we need to make sure they're heard.
We do.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways or maybe action items for our listeners?
Well, I think the most important thing is to stay curious.
Okay.
Keep learning and engage with these complex issues in a thoughtful and respectful way.
Right.
It's all about going beyond those simplistic narratives and really grappling with the nuances.
It's not always black and white.
Exactly. And, we all have a role to play in shaping how this conversation evolves.
We do.
Whether it's through voting or advocating for our beliefs or simply having open and honest discussions with people who might see things differently.
Right.
We can all contribute to creating a more informed and engaged society.
You're absolutely right. It's about taking ownership of this conversation.
Right.
And realizing it's not just about the politicians or the religious leaders.
It's about all of us.
Yeah, we're the ones who shape the future, and it's up to us to decide what kind of world we want to live in.
That's a really powerful thought.
It is. And a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
I hope so too.
And remember, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging. We'll see you next time.